The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like insects trapped in glass. Cedar Creek Medical's third floor smelled of antiseptic and the kind of silence that comes before something breaks. Hannah Clarke had been here 8 months, and in 8 months she had learned that a hospital is just another kind of war zone. The enemy wears a white coat instead of a uniform, but the casualties are just as real. She moved through the corridors at 2:13 a.m. on a Tuesday, pushing the medication cart with the mechanical precision of someone who had learned long ago that invisibility is a skill. The skeleton crew barely registered her passing. A resident slumped over charts at the nursing station. An orderly scrolled through his phone in the break room. The night shift belonged to people like Hannah, the ones who didn't ask questions, who didn't make eye contact, who understood that the safest place to hide was in plain sight. She had been ordered to disappear after Tikrit. Officially, Captain Hannah Clarke did not exist. The Pentagon operator had been explicit, no such person had ever served. Her DD-214 showed a desk job in Germany. The records were sealed so thoroughly that when she tried to explain during the hiring interview, the HR director had looked at her like she was delusional. So Hannah had come to Norfolk with forged credentials and a single directive that felt less like an instruction and more like a sentence: disappear. And she had. She wore her invisibility the way other people wore perfume. Under her scrubs, sewn into the lining of her jacket hanging in her locker, was a faded unit patch from the 60th Air Ambulance Squadron. The colors had bleached nearly white from 8 years of sweat and sand. She had never looked at it during a shift. She only held it at 3 in the morning when she couldn't sleep, when the muscle memory of Tikrit would wake her up gasping. The patch was the last piece of proof that she had ever been anyone at all. Dr. Mercer noticed her on her 3rd shift. Not because she did anything wrong. Because she did everything too well. His attention had the quality of a spotlight sweeping across darkness, sudden and searching and impossible to escape once you'd caught it. He stood in the medication bay while Hannah documented a post-operative patient's wound assessment with the precision of someone cataloging a crime scene. Every detail. Every measurement. Every observation that contradicted what the surgical report claimed. Mercer's jawline tightened. He watched her finish the entry, watched her initial it with the kind of steady hand that comes from having performed emergency procedures in worse light than any hospital could offer. What Mercer saw wasn't competence. It was a threat. The hospital's medical supply contract with Meridian Healthcare Solutions had been generating an extra $40,000 a month for the past 18 months. Equipment marked up by 40%. Surgical instruments that cost 3 times what they should. Ordering patterns that made sense only if someone wanted them to be impossible to trace. Mercer's arrangement with the vendor worked because nobody looked too closely. Because most nurses charted in the broad strokes that made billing departments happy. But Hannah Clarke documented like a prosecutor building a case. Her notes on supply usage contradicted the charges. Her inventory observations created a paper trail that pointed directly at the inflated orders. On her 2nd week, she had flagged a discrepancy in the sterile field count for a routine appendectomy. The numbers didn't match. The surgical report claimed 18 units of gauze. The inventory showed 24 units removed. 4 units could be written off as waste. But Hannah had documented every single one. The flagging system would catch that kind of detail. The hospital's billing auditors would catch it. And if they looked at one surgery, they'd look at all of them. Mercer needed her gone before she noticed the real numbers. Before she understood what she was looking at. The break room on the 4th shift was where Hannah ate her lunch alone. It had been this way for 7 weeks, ever since Mercer had begun making comments during morning rounds about staff who didn't fit the culture at Cedar Creek Medical. Some people come to a hospital thinking they can hide, he'd said to the assembled nurses, his eyes deliberately landing on Hannah. But we have standards. We have expectations. Not everyone has the right temperament for patient care. The message was clear. The nurses understood it the way animals understand scent marking. Hannah Clarke was not part of the pack. When she entered the break room on her 4th week, 3 nurses were reheating coffee and discussing a patient's family drama. They saw her. Their conversation stopped. One of them, Jessica, who had been friendly during Hannah's first month, gathered her lunch and stood up. The other two followed. They didn't say anything. They just left. The room went so quiet you could hear the refrigerator humming. Hannah sat down with her sandwich and her protein drink and ate in the silence, her hands perfectly steady around the bread and turkey. The tremor didn't come until she was alone in her car at 11 p.m., and even then she'd learned to recognize it for what it really was, not fear, but the particular strain of holding your composure while being systematically erased. Patient rounds began at 6 a.m. Hannah kept her eyes down the way she had for 8 months, the way she had learned to do in Tikrit when the staff officers came through to inspect the forward surgical unit. Attention meant scrutiny. Scrutiny meant questions. Questions meant exposure. She moved through the ward with Dr. Mercer and the resident team, her chart positioned at an angle where she could write observations without looking up. Room 312. Post-op day 2, total knee replacement. Vital stable. Incision clean. Dressing dry. She documented every detail. Room 314. Pneumonia, day 5 of antibiotics. Breath sounds improving. Fever dropping. The antibiotic choice was correct, though the dosing seemed high. Hannah noted it anyway. Room 316. And then the elevator doors opened, and she heard the voice on the intercom crackling something about a code being called in the ER. Mercer's pager went off. He glanced at his watch, 6:27 a.m., and told the resident to continue rounds without him. He walked past Hannah without acknowledgement, but his eyes lingered on her chart just long enough that she understood he was still counting. Still watching. Still trying to figure out how much she had already seen. The chart was the problem. That's what would drive everything that came next. The chart, and the fact that Hannah Clarke didn't know how to document like someone who was hiding. She documented like someone who had spent years in a place where precision meant the difference between a patient breathing and a patient bleeding out. She documented like someone trained by the Air Force to create records that could survive an investigation. She documented like Captain Hannah Clarke, though no such person existed anywhere in the official record anymore. Her hand stayed steady. Her notes stayed precise. And Dr. Mercer kept watching, trying to figure out what she was, never imagining that the quiet nurse pushing the medication cart had survived something the Pentagon needed buried, that she was following an order more important than any hospital policy, that she had learned long ago how to disappear so completely that even she sometimes forgot she had ever been real. The patient's family filled the room like a held breath, daughter on one side of the bed, husband standing in the back corner, both watching the nurse with eyes that had learned to trust no one. Mrs. Chen lay beneath the fluorescent panels, her chest wound wrapped in gauze that had started bleeding through at the edges, a dark stain spreading like a question mark. Hannah knelt beside the bed to assess the dressing, her movements precise, methodical, the way hands move when they have done something 10,000 times before. Dr. Mercer appeared in the doorway the way certain men always appear, announced by the shift in air pressure before anyone actually sees them. He stood there for exactly 3 seconds, watching Hannah's fingers work the edges of the bandage, and his expression hardened into something that looked like recognition but tasted like hunger. "What is this?" His voice was calm. That made it worse. Hannah didn't look up. "Post-op assessment. The edge is separating. Step back." She stepped back. The family watched. Mercer leaned in, his movements theatrical, his sigh deep enough for everyone to hear. He examined the wound for 14 seconds, Hannah counted them, then straightened up with the posture of a man about to deliver a verdict. His eyes found Mrs. Chen's daughter first, then the husband, then finally Hannah, and when he spoke his voice carried the particular cruelty of a man who had learned long ago that authority and humiliation were the same instrument. "This wound care is criminally incompetent." Each word landed separate, like stones into still water. Criminally incompetent. I don't know what protocols they were teaching wherever you trained, but this is not Cedar Creek Medical standard. The daughter's hand found her mother's. The husband's jaw tightened. "Rewrap it," Mercer said to Hannah. "And this time, try to remember that post-surgical patients are human beings, not practice dummies. Hannah took the sterile supplies from the cart. Her hands were steady as a surgical laser. She cleaned the wound with saline, her movements exact, each step the choreography of someone who had done this while mortar fire painted the night sky orange in Tikrit, who had held a man's ribcage open with her bare hands while rounds shredded the tent around them. She applied fresh gauze, secured it with tape, checked the tension, checked it again. Perfect. Flawless. Mercer stood there the entire time, his presence like a weight on her shoulders, his silence worse than any words. When she was finished, he stepped forward, lifted the edge of the dressing, looked at it for 3 seconds, and turned away. He didn't say it was better. He didn't acknowledge it at all. He simply walked out, leaving the family in a state of collective confusion, their trust in Hannah scattered like ashes. The daughter whispered something to her mother. The husband wouldn't meet Hannah's eyes. She stepped back into the corridor and her jaw clenched. Just once. That was all the reaction she allowed herself. The muscle memory of Tikrit wanted to take over, the part of her that had been trained to survive humiliation as a tactic, to absorb it and weaponize it, to turn shame into fuel. But she pushed that down into the locked compartment where it belonged and walked toward the medication cart. The break room smelled like bitter coffee and the particular staleness that comes from recycled air and fluorescent panels burning since 6 in the morning. Hannah sat at the table with her lunch and a salad, precisely measured, the protein weighed to the gram. 3 other nurses sat across the room, their conversation stopping the moment she pulled the chair out. She didn't look at them. She opened her container and ate with the focus of someone counting calories or counting seconds or counting anything except the sound of chairs scraping backward. By the time she'd finished half the salad, the room was empty. She understood the choreography now. Mercer had been working them for 8 months, dropping comments in the break room, in the hallways, in front of the pharmacy technician. Staff who don't fit our culture. Some people just don't have the bedside manner this unit requires. I wonder if she's really qualified for this level of acuity. The words were seeds. They had grown into something visible, something that made her presence in a room feel like a disruption, like static on a radio frequency. The write-up appeared on the unit board at 14:38. Hannah saw the timestamp when she was checking the staffing assignment. The paper was printed in standard hospital format, official enough to be untouchable, her name centered at the top like a headline, Hannah Clarke, RN. The accusations were surgical, failure to follow documentation protocols. Inconsistent charting methodology. Non-compliance with unit standards. 3 pages. Each one carefully constructed to look professional, objective, utterly reasonable. This was the 3rd one. Mercer had filed one 8 weeks ago, something about medication verification procedures. Another 6 weeks ago, a patient family complaint that Hannah had later discovered the patient's daughter had never actually filed. Both of them had accumulated in her personnel file like sediment, building a foundation that could eventually support the weight of a termination. She read it twice, standing in front of the unit board, her jaw locked tight enough to crack teeth. Around her, staff moved past, pretending not to notice her reading her own professional execution. Pretending not to notice her at all. She walked to the administrative office and signed the acknowledgement form. Her signature was steady. The date was steady. Everything about her was steady, a quality that was beginning to feel less like strength and more like a skill that had been beaten into her systematically across years and continents. Then she walked to the supply closet on the 4th floor, the one nobody used anymore since they'd installed the new medication dispensary system. The door closed behind her and the light was automatic, fluorescent, casting everything in the particular shade of institutional yellow that looks like surrender. She closed her eyes. The desert came first, not as a memory but as a sensory experience, a return to something that was still waiting inside her muscle tissue. Sand in her teeth. The smell of diesel and copper and something burning that she never wanted to identify. The sound of the ventilator wheeze as she pushed air into a young Marine's lungs while his chest cavity was open to the night, while the surgical lights cast shadows that looked like enemy combatants. Pain was information. She had learned to read it the way other people read text. The trembling she felt now wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was the full force of her actual nature, Captain Hannah Clarke, 75th Ranger Regiment attached to JSOC, 18 months in theater, 37 combat saves in a single 72-hour period, compressed down into the size of a supply closet, contained, invisible. She opened her eyes. The closet smelled like bleach and old bandage boxes. She breathed. The emergency appendectomy was scheduled for 1:22 a.m., which meant it arrived at 1:34 a.m. with the kind of chaos that only night shift could generate with any authenticity. The patient was Colonel James Kirkwood, Air Force, supposedly in for a routine gallbladder removal, but his vital signs had degraded somewhere between the pre-op unit and the OR, his blood pressure dropping like a stone, his O2 saturation spiraling downward in that terrifying way that meant something was bleeding internally that wasn't supposed to bleed. Mercer was in the operating room. This was his patient's secondary procedure, so he'd scrubbed in alongside the general surgeon, Dr. Patterson. Hannah was assisting, which meant she was technically outside the primary surgical team, standing back, watching, holding retractors when asked and staying invisible when not. The incision went in clean. The appendix was inflamed, the surgery straightforward. But 15 minutes into the procedure, Patterson noticed something that made his movement slow. A small vessel was bleeding into the abdominal cavity, slow enough to have gone unnoticed during the initial examination, fast enough to be serious now. Not arterial. Not yet. But heading that direction. Patterson called for suction. More suction. The bleeding point was small, obscured by the fatty tissue around the appendiceal artery. He reached for a clamp, missed on the first attempt, and as he repositioned his instruments, the bleeding accelerated. The venous pressure changed. The O2 saturation on the monitor dropped to 89, then 84, then 78. Mercer watched from his position across the table. He didn't move. Hannah watched his hands and recognized the paralysis, not the paralysis of confusion but the paralysis of a man who had trained in protocol and guidelines and insurance regulations, not in the kind of medicine that requires split-second decisions in low-light conditions with a patient exsanguinating in front of you. Patterson called for a larger clamp. His hands were shaking. O2 sat at 71. The colonel's eyes opened, just barely, the sedation wearing off at exactly the wrong moment, his consciousness returning exactly when everything was collapsing, and his eyes found Hannah. She was moving before anyone acknowledged her, crossing the sterile field in a way that technically violated every protocol in the hospital manual. She took a 14-gauge angiocath needle from the tray and positioned it at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, and drove it in with a kind of pressure that came from having done this with mortar fire painting the sky, hands moving not from thought but from the deep mechanical memory of survival. The colonel's eyes locked on hers. "I know that technique," he whispered through the ventilator. His voice was barely audible, but the words landed like detonation. "Who taught you to save lives like that?" And that's when the real nightmare began. The sulfuric stench hit her at 2:07 a.m. Not the familiar antiseptic bite of bleach or the sickle sweet decay of necrotic tissue. Something acrid. Chemical. Wrong. Hannah's nose flared once as she made rounds through the overnight skeleton crew, 5 nurses, 2 residents, a charge nurse drowsing at the desk with lukewarm coffee going cold beside her. The ventilation system wheezed its mechanical rhythm, pulling something toxic through the ducts from the basement. She stopped at the charge nurse's station. "We need to check the HVAC." The charge nurse, Margaret, been here 17 years, didn't look up from her phone. "Anxiety again, Hannah? You're always smelling things." "It's the stress from Dr. Mercer." Hannah's jaw tightened. She didn't argue. Didn't explain. Just turned and walked toward the basement access, her shoes clicking against the tile in a rhythm she'd learned in Tikrit. Purpose. Control. 1 foot in front of the other like it mattered. The basement smelled worse. Industrial. Choking. The ventilation conduit was leaking a pale gas that looked like heat shimmer made visible, curling out of a fractured coupling near the HVAC unit. She was already moving back upstairs. Not asking. Not requesting permission. She pulled the fire alarm at 2:14 a.m. The sound was primal, a banshee wail that cut through the hospital's sleeping heart and dragged it awake. Overhead speakers crackled. Automated voice. Code orange. Evacuate. Code orange. Evacuate. Margaret appeared at the nurse's station, her face cycling through surprise to irritation to something that looked like fear. Hannah, what did you? Gas leak. Basement. Move. Now. It wasn't a request. It was a command. The kind she hadn't used in 8 months of being invisible. Her voice dropped half an octave, and every staff member within 10 feet responded without thinking. A resident abandoned a charting station and started clearing patient rooms. 2 nurses began unhooking monitors. Margaret's hand moved to the phone. The elevator door slid open and Mercer emerged, still buttoning a cardigan over scrubs, his expression a perfect blend of annoyance and authority. What is the meaning of this? We don't evacuate Cedar Creek for a drill. Not a drill, Hannah said. Gas detection sensors in the basement triggered at 2:08. Sulfur compound, concentration rising. Hazmat's inbound. We have maybe 4 minutes before the ventilation system pulls it through the 4th floor. She said it fast. Clinical. The way a soldier briefs a commanding officer. Mercer's face darkened. Not because of the gas. Because she'd spoken to him like he was the junior officer. There are protocols for this, and you don't. The first patient crashed before he finished. A cardiac monitor flatlined on 407. Audible. Unmistakable. The kind of alarm that doesn't care about protocols or hierarchy. Hannah was already moving toward the room, muscle memory and training converging into something that looked like certainty. A 48-year-old with post-op tachycardia, now in full asystole. No heartbeat. No oxygen delivery. No time. The hallway was chaos, evacuating staff, patient gurneys, equipment carts colliding, the smell getting worse, that chemical tang now so thick it tasted like burned metal and regret. Hannah pulled the patient from the room into the hallway, hooking her fingers under the stretcher rails and drawing it away from the contaminated air. Another patient crashed on 408. Then 409. The gas was a living thing, moving through the ventilation like a predator through grass, indiscriminate and efficient. Get me a laryngoscope and a 7.5 endotracheal tube, she said to nobody and everybody. A resident thrust the equipment into her hands without asking why a nurse was commanding the airway. Because that's what leaders look like in crisis, they don't sound uncertain. She tilted the patient's head back. Found the anatomical landmarks with her fingers, thyroid cartilage, cricoid ring, the delicate membrane between them. The penlight from her pocket went between her teeth. She could taste the plastic and the stress sweat of the resident watching her, learning. The laryngoscope blade went in smooth as silk, and there it was, the vocal cords. White. Pristine. Like 2 marble doors. The endotracheal tube slid through in one motion. A whisper of resistance. Then through. Handbag ventilations, she said. The bag pumped. O2 sat. 68. Let's go. Watch the numbers. The room was silent except for the rhythm of the bag compressing. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like mechanical insects. Mercer was screaming somewhere behind her, something about liability, unauthorized protocols, exceeding scope of practice, but his voice was background noise now. Static. Data she didn't need to process. 72. Climbing. The patient's chest rose and fell with mechanical precision. She could feel the tube in place like a violin string finding its perfect note. 8 months of invisibility had done nothing to dull the muscle memory. The hands that had held together 347 lives in a forward surgical unit in Tikrit still knew exactly how much pressure, how much angle, how much faith. 81. Another patient crashed. 3rd floor now. The gas was moving faster than anyone had calculated. Hannah's eyes flicked up from her current patient to the resident. Start a second team. I need another tube in for 04. Move. She didn't say please. Didn't ask. The resident ran. 86, the monitor called out. 89. 92. Sinus rhythm. The room went so quiet you could hear the building's nervous system humming through the walls. For minutes of perfect silence from Mercer. She kept her eyes on her patient, kept the bag going, kept breathing when the chemical smell tried to claw down her throat. The evacuation had pulled 180 people out of Cedar Creek's northern wing. By 5:43 a.m., the hazmat team had isolated the leak, sealed the basement, and cleared the contamination. 11 patients intubated in the hallway. 11 patients breathing because one nurse had smelled something wrong and refused to accept its anxieties as an answer. The stretchers were being rolled toward the ambulances now, her patient stabilized on portable ventilators, lines running for fluids through arms that weren't hers to save anymore. That's when the doors burst open. Not hazmat. Not paramedics. Hospital administration. Mercer walking beside the hospital administrator, his hands gesturing like a conductor leading an orchestra of accusation. His voice was sharp as a scalpel now. She exceeded her scope of practice without physician authorization. She gave orders to residents. She contaminated the emergency response with her anxiety protocols. The administrator looked at the hallway. 11 breathing patients. 11 lives. Then back at Mercer. Then at Hannah. Hannah didn't move. Didn't explain. Just kept her hands on the patient's shoulders, keeping them stable for transport, her eyes forward like a soldier at attention. We'll discuss this in my office, the administrator said. But not to Hannah. To Mercer. That was the last time anyone called her just a nurse. The words hadn't been spoken yet, but they were already obsolete. The next voice they heard wasn't human. It was the radio on the administrator's hip crackling with a call sign she hadn't heard in 8 months, and someone on the other end asking for Captain Hannah Clarke by her military name. By 6:13 a.m., the termination papers were already typed. Mercer stood in the administrator's office with a file folder 2 inches thick, his voice carrying the bureaucratic precision of a man who had weaponized hospital policy like a surgeon wields a scalpel. Emergency authority protocols. Exceeding scope of practice without physician supervision. Creating panic and evacuating the building without proper chain of command. Creating panic. That phrase hung in the air like exhaust fumes. 11 patients intubated. 11 people breathing who would have drowned in their own pulmonary fluid if she had followed protocol and waited for a doctor to make the call. But the paperwork said panic. The paperwork said insubordination. The paperwork said she was done. The administrator nodded. The decision was already made before she walked into that room. Mercer had spent 8 months building this moment, the conditioning of the staff, the disciplinary write-ups, the isolation, and this was the payoff. One crisis, expertly handled by a nurse who shouldn't have been capable of what she did, meant she had to disappear. Not because she'd failed. Because she'd succeeded too well. Because she'd revealed something about Mercer that the video recording from that family member's phone had just broadcast to 2 million strangers on the internet, and the administrator had already seen it. Mercer screaming. Mercer insulting. Mercer standing in the hallway while Hannah Clarke intubated an unresponsive 8-year-old boy with her hand steady as a neurosurgeon while his voice cracked with panic about liability. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Her badge, they said. Her keys. Now. Security arrived at 6:22 a.m. with a plastic bag and expressions that wouldn't quite meet her eyes. They knew. The whole hospital was already buzzing about the viral video, about what they'd seen Mercer do, about the intubations in the hallway, about the girl who'd been standing so calmly in the smoke while chaos bloomed around her. But the paperwork said she was the problem. The paperwork trumped the video. The paperwork trumped the lives. She didn't argue. She didn't explain. She unclipped her badge, Cedar Creek Medical, ID 4471, her photograph taken on a Tuesday morning when she was still supposed to be invisible, and dropped it into the bag. Then her keys. Then she walked to her locker in the break room where 3 nurses were gathering their things. They stopped when she appeared. The silence stretched like a held breath. She collected her jacket from the locker, the one with the faded unit patch sewn into the inner lining, the one that had survived 8 months of washing and hanging and careful invisibility. No one spoke. No one moved. She had saved their patients. She had kept their families from burying them. And she was leaving the way someone leaves after a scandal, the way someone leaves after they've become contagious. The parking lot was grey with early morning. A security guard walked beside her to the exit, not threatening, just present, making sure she didn't go anywhere she wasn't supposed to go. The early shift nurses had started to arrive, and a few of them watched from the main entrance. Some had worked beside her for 8 months. Some had eaten lunch in the break room while she sat alone. Some had seen her pull a 9-year-old girl's body from under a collapsed ceiling at 2:16 a.m. and start rescue breaths before the firefighters even had the rubble cleared. And now they watched her walk out with nothing but the clothes she was wearing and a plastic bag. The Pentagon operator had a voice like someone reading from a script they'd memorized but didn't believe. No such person had served, she was told when she'd made the call from her car in the Cedar Creek parking garage at 7:38 a.m. Her DD-214 showed a desk job in Germany. 12 years as a file clerk at Ramstein Air Base. 12 years shuffling papers and organizing requisitions and existing on paper as someone so unremarkable that no one would ever look twice at her name on a roster. That was the price of surviving something the Air Force needed buried. That was the trade-off for making it home alive from Tikrit. They erased you first, and then they let you breathe. Her apartment was cold when she arrived at 15:06 p.m. Still in scrubs. Still smelling like antiseptic and adrenaline and the chemical tang of the gas that had leaked through Cedar Creek's ventilation system at 2:02 a.m. The scrubs were contaminated. She should have changed them at the hospital. But the hospital didn't exist anymore. Not for her. Not in any way that mattered. Mia was home from school. Mia, who was 7 years old and had memorized the explanation that Mommy worked at the hospital and helped people who were sick and that's why Mommy was gone at night sometimes. Mia, who had drawn a picture of her mother in a blue uniform standing next to a hospital bed, and it was hanging on the refrigerator with the date 0/15 in the corner in careful pencil print. Mia, who was sitting at the kitchen table when Hannah walked in, her small face looking up with confusion that was already beginning to shift into something else. "Why are you home, Mommy? You're always there. People need you there." Hannah sat down across from her daughter. The table was the same one they'd eaten breakfast at that morning before work. The kitchen window looked out on Norfolk streets where other people were driving to jobs they would keep, where other people were walking into buildings that would let them stay. Her hands were perfectly still on the table. A trained response. A reflex from muscle memory. Never let them see the shaking. People did need her. That was the problem. That was why she had to leave. Mia's small voice filled the silence. A child's inability to understand why the world didn't work the way it was supposed to. Why her mother was home at 3 in the afternoon in wet scrubs that smelled wrong. Why there was something in Mommy's eyes that looked like someone had broken her and then carefully glued her back together in a way that didn't quite match the original shape. Hannah reached across the table and took her daughter's hand. The skin was warm and small and completely unblemished by the world. She had joined the Air Force to protect moments like this. She had gone to Tikrit to keep children like Mia safe. She had come to Cedar Creek Medical to disappear and keep her daughter safe by staying invisible. And she had been fired for saving lives anyway. The rain started at 16:42 p.m. Not a gentle fall but a hard hammering against the apartment windows, the kind of rain that came in sheets and made the world outside look like it was dissolving. Hannah had sent Mia to bed at 19:30 with a story about a nurse who helped people and how sometimes grown-ups had to make hard choices. The lies came easier than she expected. Maybe because she'd been lying for 8 months. Maybe because lying was just another survival skill, like intubating in the dark, like staying calm while the building filled with toxic gas, like accepting a termination you didn't deserve and walking out like it didn't matter. She was sitting at the kitchen table at 21:13 p.m. when the really hard part started. The moment when the adrenaline burned off and the body remembered it was human. Her hands began to shake. Just slight tremors at first, a vibration in her fingers where they wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. The shaking moved up her wrists, settled into her shoulders. Her breathing came in precise, controlled patterns, in through the nose for 4 counts, hold for 4, out through the mouth for 4. Tactical breathing. The trick they taught you before you deployed so you wouldn't break when everything was trying to kill you. But this wasn't a deployment. This was a kitchen in Norfolk with rain hammering the windows and her daughter asleep in the next room and no one coming. No rescue helicopter. No team dropping in at dawn. No extraction plan. Just a woman who had spent 8 months learning to be invisible, and who had saved 11 lives yesterday, and who would probably never get to be a nurse again because the paperwork said she was a problem and the paperwork always won. She pulled on the jacket. The faded unit patch was still there inside the lining, the threads rough under her fingers. The patch from the 886th Forward Surgical Unit. The patch from Tikrit. The patch from a time when she was Captain Hannah Clarke and people saluted when she walked into a room and called her and did what she said because they knew she had seen combat and come back and kept her people alive. She almost pulled the threads out. Almost tore the patch free and threw it away and stopped being whoever she used to be. Just burned the bridge completely and became the person she was supposed to be according to the Pentagon, a desk clerk at Ramstein who had never existed at all. And then her phone rang at 21:08 p.m. The number on the screen was blocked. She almost didn't answer. But the rain was so loud and the silence in the apartment was so heavy and something in her recognized the weight of what was about to happen. She pressed the phone to her ear. The voice on the other end was clipped, military, precise. Not a question. A statement. A notification. A helicopter was 23 minutes out. 2 teams were en route from Naval Station Norfolk. A colonel in the Air Force had woken up in his hospital bed and asked for the nurse who had recognized his bleed before it became cardiac arrest. And when the hospital staff said she didn't work there anymore, he'd made 1 phone call. Just 1. And now the sky was about to open up and everything was going to change. The first sound came at 22:06 p.m. A distant bass note that wasn't quite thunder. The kind of sound that makes a body remember what it feels like to be saved. The helicopter sound hadn't faded from her ears when she pulled into Cedar Creek Medical's parking lot at 6:22 a.m. to collect the rest of her things. Her uniform hung in a locker downstairs. Her badge was already in a plastic bag marked with her name in clinic office handwriting. She'd been awake for 31 hours. The rain had stopped sometime before dawn, leaving the asphalt gleaming like wet obsidian under the parking lot lights. She wasn't expecting the motorcade. The black sedan pulled into the circular drive at the main entrance, and 2 figures in Air Force dress blues emerged before it had fully stopped. Then came a third, taller, shoulders that seemed to carry their own gravity, the kind of presence that made people unconsciously step backward. The colonel. She recognized the gait before she recognized the face. Command posture. Forward Surgical Unit bearing. She'd spent 18 nights with him across an operating table in a sandstorm, their hands moving in synchronization while mortars hit the perimeter wire. He was asking for her by name. The receptionist at the front desk, nervous energy rippling through her frame, pointed toward the parking lot. Toward Hannah. The colonel walked the asphalt like it belonged to him. His aides flanked 3 paces back, their dress uniforms pristine, their faces carrying the focused calm of men trained to witness consequential moments. When he reached her, his hand extended. Not a handshake. A gesture of recognition between people who'd held the same blood on their hands. Reaper, he said. The word crossed the parking lot like a detonation. That call sign belonged to someone who didn't officially exist. That call sign belonged to a woman who'd performed 37 surgical interventions in a forward operating base during a single night when the field hospital was overrun, 37 lives extracted from the brink in 14 hours, working without sedation after the anesthesia ran dry on casualty 23, continuing with whiskey and the kind of focus that only comes from understanding the cost of failure. One of the aides stepped forward with a citation. His voice carried the formal precision of military ceremony, even in a parking lot at 6 in the morning. Captain Hannah Clarke. Bronze Star with Valor. Awarded for exceptional medical intervention under sustained enemy fire during Operation Sentinel, Tikrit Forward Surgical Unit. 37 combat saves in a single operational window. Field thoracotomy procedures performed without standard equipment. Casualty survival rate, 94%. A Marine Lieutenant Colonel produced a velvet case. Then another. The Bronze Star Medal caught the pale morning light. The purple ribbon of the Purple Heart. The Combat Medical Badge with its caduceus and laurel wreath, the one decoration that meant you'd been wounded in the line of duty, that you'd paid in blood for the right to wear it. These were locked in the Pentagon archives for 12 years, the Marine said quietly. Classified above top secret. Your service was erased because the operation was buried. You were erased because the operation was buried. But today that changes. Dr. Mercer chose that moment to appear in the hospital doorway. His face cycled through emotions like a broken projector. First confusion, who were these uniforms, why were they in his hospital parking lot? Then understanding dawned, and with it came horror. A hospital board member stood beside him, phone lifted, screen playing a video. The footage was 16 minutes long and approaching 2 million views on YouTube. The video showed the evacuation. The gas leak. But it showed something else, Dr. Mercer screaming. His face contorted. His voice cracking with fury as Hannah intubated an unresponsive 8-year-old child in the hallway, her hands moving with perfect precision while his actual voice recorded by a family member, shrieked about protocol violations and scope creep and liability. And it showed Hannah not flinching. Not pausing. Not acknowledging him. Just continuing to save a life while he stood behind her screaming about regulations. The board member's phone buzzed. Then again. Again. Within 60 seconds, he was on a call. His expression shifted from curiosity to concern to something deeper, something that looked like watching dominoes begin to fall in a pattern you couldn't stop. The call lasted for minutes. When it ended, his hands had developed a visible tremor. That was Dr. Harrison, he said to Mercer. His voice had gone quiet. Your medical school mentor. He saw the video. He released a statement 20 minutes ago disavowing you. Said he'd been wrong about your character for 20 years. He's called the board chair directly. There's an emergency meeting at 9 a.m. Mercer's hands clenched. Unclenched. The skin around his eyes had gone pale, not the paleness of fear, but the paleness of a man watching his future calcify in real time. He opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again and nothing came out but a ragged breath. By afternoon, the board had stripped his medical license. Not suspended. Stripped. 3 days later, the hospital terminated his employment. A week after that, the state medical board initiated a formal investigation into the inflated billing from his kickback arrangement with the supply vendor. The vendor had been caught on email. The documentation that Hannah's meticulous charting had flagged was now evidence in a fraud case. 6 months later, Cedar Creek Medical installed a new trauma wing. A dedicated unit for veteran patients. Free care. Pro bono consultations. They offered Hannah the position of Chief of Trauma Medicine. She declined. Instead, she accepted the role of mentor to a new class of combat medics coming out of the Air Force training pipeline. She was standing in the hospital's new education wing in her restored captain's uniform, the fabric crisp, the rank insignia gleaming with the kind of polish that only comes from attention earned rather than inherited, when she glanced out the window. The parking lot held a white medical supply van. The lettering on the side reads Healthcare Express. The man loading boxes moved with hesitation in his shoulders. His hands trembled slightly on each carton. The name tag on his polo shirt read, Steve. He flinched when another employee called him Doc, a word he'd worn for 15 years and could no longer claim. Behind Hannah, 14 combat medics in their dress uniforms watched their instructor's expression. Her eyes stayed on that parking lot for exactly 3 seconds. Then she turned back to them. People like that man built a system where the people who saved lives were treated as liabilities, she said. Where meticulous work was punished. Where silence was rewarded and speaking up was erased. That system is still out there. Still operating. Still trying to bury people who know too much. She paused. The young medics, all of them trained to notice tiny shifts in breathing, in posture, in the micro-movements that preceded action, leaned forward. Your job isn't to hide who you are. Your job isn't to make people comfortable with your competence. Your job is to walk into a room knowing your own value and refusing to let anyone convince you otherwise. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. She picked up the first training module and began to teach. One of the medics, a 19-year-old from Fort Hood, raised his hand. Captain, how did you survive it? The humiliation. The isolation. Being made invisible when you knew you weren't. Hannah set down the material. You survive it by understanding one thing: their opinion of you is not your truth. I walked into Cedar Creek Medical knowing I'd saved 37 lives in a single night. No write-up could change that. No public humiliation could change that. No amount of isolation could change that. So I let him see what he wanted to see, a quiet nurse who didn't fight back. And when the moment came where people needed the person I actually was, I stopped performing for him. Scars tell stories. This one, she gestured to the faded unit patch visible on her dress uniform collar, this one tells the story of a woman who learned that the quietest person in the room might just be the one holding everything together. The young medics watched her with the kind of attention usually reserved for sacred texts. They saw a woman in her mid-40s with silver threading through her dark hair, with eyes that carried the weight of having made impossible choices under fire, with hands that moved with the kind of precision that only came from practice at the edge of life and death. They saw themselves, years from now. If they chose to fight. If they chose to stay visible. If they chose to refuse erasure. Hannah turned the projection to the next slide. The first lesson was about resuscitation under fire. The second would be about trauma stabilization with improvised equipment. The third would be about knowing your own value when systems were built to convince you otherwise. Outside, the sun was climbing toward noon. The parking lot was emptying. The man in the white van would spend the rest of his shift carrying boxes that weighed less than the weight of his choices. He would go home to a house divided. His medical degree, framed and hung, would become the thing his family looked away from. But here, in this room, 15 military medical personnel were learning from someone who'd been erased by institutional power and had chosen to become visible again anyway. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your value, if you've ever had to hide who you really were to survive a system built against you, tell us in the comments. And if you believe institutions need people willing to refuse erasure, please like and subscribe for more stories about the ones who fight back.